Hi everyone, Sajid Amit here. So this is not going to be a typical review. This is more along the lines of a systems update. And I want to talk about why increasingly I have been gravitating towards the FOCAL Utopia, and instead of the Susvaras, which I have here, or the Abyss AB1266, which I have here. And of course, I've done a ranking in the past. I've done a shootout of a bunch of high-end headphones, and the Utopia was not among the top 4. But I think over time, I just feel like I gravitate towards this far more. I feel like I listen to this far more and use this far more. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about two different approaches to audio. One approach is one in which you have specialist headphones, and the other approach, of course, is one in which you have an all-rounder headphone, and what each one of you should go for, what I go for, and how that might have changed. So that's the first part of the review. The second part, I just want to get into debates about performance of the Utopia versus the Susvara, and all the talk about Soundstage of the Utopia, and how much does Soundstage really matter, and what does Soundstage actually mean, right? And I want to question a lot of audiophile jargon, and I want to do that when I talk about Utopia versus Susvara versus TC. And then the final part of the discussion here, I want to talk about source pairings. So this is the FiiO M17 DAB. I want to talk a bit about this, not too extensively because this will get its own review. How I drive my headphones, what I've been driving Utopia with, etc. So now, just to start off this discussion, guys, so first of all, when I got into the hobby, I had an HD650, which is a supreme all-rounder headphone, and honestly speaking, I was so happy with the headphone. I was driving it off a very cheap Yulong DART Canary, a very cheap $250 amplifier that I was using to drive, a DAC amp that I was using to drive the 650 with. There was an issue with my 650. One of the drivers failed, which I'm told is very uncommon in terms of, most people don't have a 650 failing on them. So that happened to me. That got me on this sort of binge, right? And that, but in a weird way, that was great for me because that made me more brave, and that made me more willing to try out things and hire an audio gear. That led to the FOCAL Clears, which I thought wasn't as much fun at that time compared to the 650. I later realized that what was sort of stifling the FOCAL Clear in my case was the Topic A90 and D90, which made the FOCAL Clear more metallic than it really was. And I also realized the importance of burning in a headphone, because the FOCAL Clears at that time weren't as much fun for me. But then once I actually sold it off, and there's this funny thing in audio where people say that when people sell off a DAC or an amp without proper burn-in, the real benefit or the real winner is the second owner, because the second owner then gets a burnt-in product at the lower price, and the second owner actually gets to enjoy the sound more. So obviously you know what camp it comes from when it comes to burning in, and whether I believe it in burning in or not. Of course I do. I think electronic gears change massively with burn-in, and it's not just brain burn-in, because some gears sound terrible when they're not burnt in. So it's not a minute difference, just terrible, and in some cases unlistenable. So anyway, so that was my story of how I got into Summit Fi, got the Susvaras, etc. So when I first got Susvaras, this was more than a year and a half ago. For me, this was an all-rounder headphone. It could do everything, and it still is an all-rounder headphone. But, and then I tried the Abyss. So while I still think the Susvara is slightly better all-rounder headphone than the Abyss, I do think that with the Abyss, what happens is you just get into such a stratosphere of bass performance, especially impact. And one shouldn't just denigrate impact and treat it as just one quality of bass. And so a headphone has impact or it doesn't. Who cares if a headphone has impact? There's more to music or this hobby than impact. Yes, of course. But if you hear an Abyss properly tuned on your head, and if you've heard this and owned this for a long time, you realize that it's a testimony to the engineers at Abyss in terms of how well they replicate impact, because the certain parts of a song needs that sort of impact. Certain instruments, double bass, a lot of other instruments need that sort of impact to take you to that sort of place of when the music was happening, of that concert feeling. So this, to some extent, made me question the Susvara, because the Susvara bass, if you haven't heard an Abyss, will sound adequate. If you haven't heard some dynamic driver, this will sound adequate, and it does. And it's a good bass. It's a pretty fast, lucid, well-controlled, textured bass. But so that is the first thing that made me that's made me question whether one headphone could do it all. That made me question what sort of approach I need to have to this hobby. So the approach I ended up with regard to the hobby is one in which I started having specialist headphones. This is a specialist headphone in my opinion. The Susvara is a specialist headphone. Of course, a lot of you will disagree. Abyss will disagree. Hyperman will disagree because no one tunes their headphones to be specialist headphones, right? Of course, every headphone manufacturer has a house sound. The Abyss house sound does have enormous bass. But because of how its mid-range is tuned and it's dry, a bit dry relative to other headphones like the Susvara, and it's a bit recessed, I don't end up enjoying vocals as much with this. Even when I'm pairing this with chains that bring its vocals out. I have paired this with an Accuphase E380 and a Holo Audio Mate, which to my mind is the best possible chain for the Abyss. Much better than a Wu Audio Wa-33 and a Dave, which is what a lot of the Abyss owners drive this with. Because the Holo Audio Mate gives this natural tonality, which is just perfect with this. And the Accuphase just has this interesting way of even widening this Abyss stage more and delivering grunt like only this headphone is capable of, while retaining a sweetness to the treble and mid-range, which only the Accuphase, in my experience, has been able to do with the Abyss. Someone else on HeadFi on the Facebook groups that I frequent mentioned the enormity of the performance of the Abyss with the Accuphase. But that's it. I mean, my goal isn't to just talk about the Abyss on this video, but my goal is just to talk about my journey. So this headphone is a specialist headphone in my opinion because of its dry and recessed mid-range, relatively speaking, which disallows me from using this with vocal-oriented tracks from laid-back genres. But this is amazing for heavy metal, the best that I've heard. Then moving on to the Hyperman Susvara. Susvara is actually pretty good for certain genres of rock, grunge being one of them, where mid-range performance comes into play, where a lot of vocal performance are tokened, or vocal frequency ranges are tokened. So things like grunge and alternative is very good with the Susvara. Not so much rock, because rock can sound a bit on the trebly side, I think, because the balance to treble and bass for the Susvaras, I think, is there, but the bass is still a somewhat plasticky. So the other thing I keep thinking about, we reviewers are so shackled by the terminologies we use. Like, we use these terminologies to make life easier for us, to make life easier for you. But we become victims of these terminologies because timbre, for example, right? We keep talking about whether this headphone has great timbre or this headphone doesn't have great timbre, but then the Susvara, which I have also said has great timbre. Honestly, this is of course a revised opinion, has great timbre, but not in the bass. Susvara bass does not sound as natural as the Abyss or LCD4 or the Utopia bass. Now, when people talk about timbre and Summit Fi, the first thing people say, oh, this has a metallic timbre, those that have read forums. And this has just caught on. Another situation in which someone says something and then, a headphone just develops a reputation out of thin air. Someone once said this is analytical. So everyone and his mother who's not heard this is saying this is analytical, without hearing this often. This came out at a time when there were not many Summit Fi headphones around, so many people, I think, also thought, and people who often bought this were upgrading from headphones that were not as resolving. So I think this got a bad rep for being analytical, but actually it's not as analytical, I think, if one has to go by flavors of music, as a Hyperman Susvara or an Abyss AB12665TC. I find the Utopia to be far more forgiving of tracks, let's say, for example, which is my definition of whether a headphone is analytical, or the other end, which is perhaps musical. So this is far more forgiving of tracks than I think either the Susvara or the TC. It's also less resolving. So where I'm going with this, guys, is don't take our word blindly for everything. Because if I'm saying to you, or anyone is saying to you, that a certain headphone is technically more proficient, that doesn't mean that that's a headphone you should buy. People love the Meze Elite, and it's not as technically proficient as it should be, some people say, because of its price point. And people should love the Meze Elite because it might be something that you want, something that you need, because of its beauty, its aesthetics, its comfort. And even if it doesn't give you the technical performance for its price point, it might be what you need. People will say the Susvara is more technically proficient than the Utopia, and it's true. If you've heard of Utopia, you're like, my God. And if this is the first Summit Fi headphone you have, you'll be like, my God, this is so technically proficient. Nothing can beat this. But things can beat this. The Susvara is more technically proficient than the Utopia. Honestly speaking, I think the Abyss is more technically proficient than the Susvaras. And then some owners of the TC who've only heard the TC might be like, oh, this is the pinnacle. But there are other headphones that actually are more technically proficient than the TC, like the RAL requisite SR1A, which is more resolving, has more spacious soundstage and imaging and everything. But I so love the SR1A because it wasn't my cup of tea. So my point is, guys, we reviewers are often too caught up with thinking through these parameters of technical performance and tonal performance. So technical performance, we talk about detail, soundstage, imaging, and timbre, and speed and dynamics. And it's important to have a framework with it, without which most reviews would become rambling reviews like this. And most of you will not have the patience to sit through a rambling review. So we have structure to review. We talk about objective sound, subjective sound. We talk about a lot of ways, we break down technical performance into detail, soundstage, imaging, speed and dynamics, and timbre. We talk about tonality. We have a graph in front of you. We try to make sense of the graph for you. Graphs have their place, of course. Graphs are extremely important. If you've had enough experience, you put an earphone on or a headphone on, you'll start thinking of the graph. And because the graph can be very telling and revealing. However, not always. This, for example, is a good example of how this doesn't graph so well in terms of bass, and then people will think it doesn't have bass impact, but my God, it has bass impact. It has more bass impact than Susvara does. So where I'm going with this is, I can talk to you about technical performance and rank headphones based on technical and tonal parameters at some point, because we call tonal performance an objective criteria. I'll be forced to say that, oh yeah, the bass does not adhere to the Harman tonality as well as the Susvara does. So this is A and this is B in terms of tonal performance. At some point I'll talk about, oh, this is more technical than the Utopia is. It's more detailed, has a bigger soundstage. So this is A and this is B when it comes to technical performance. Or I'll say, oh, the timbre of this is like, neither of them are extremely natural sounding, or this is more natural sounding, so this is A and this is B. And then finally I'll say, so this wins. Now, I've done all that. It was fun for me. But I just want to make sure that you don't get completely beholden to these sorts of things, because I think there's a way in which we reviewers need to have separate rankings, right? And because rankings, and I think we need to review rankings. So this is my attempt at, to some extent, offering an alternative perspective to my previous ranking. My previous ranking stands if I were ranking through reviewer criteria such as technical performance, tonal performance, timbre. But then I think when we get caught up within that framework, we often miss enjoyment. And I don't think you can just deconstruct enjoyment into these three things, technical and tonal, and then the rest is aesthetics, build, and comfort. You can't. Because when I was from that mindset where I wanted to own multiple headphones, because each headphone is something really well, this does mid-range exceedingly well. Among the mid-range champs that, among headphones that I've tried, this does bass extremely well and great for dynamic and more aggressive genres. So I was using this for metal and Susvara for more laid-back genres. And I was fine switching headphones during a listening session. I was fine switching headphones. I was fine switching tracks. I had different playlists for the Susvara, different playlist for the bass. But then I rediscovered the Utopia, and I rediscovered the joy of not having to switch playlists. I rediscovered the privilege of not having to have genre-specific playlists for a headphone. Because with this, I can play Tori Amos, and then I can play Metallica, and then I can play Iron Maiden, and then I can play Corey Taylor, and then I can play Alice in Chains, and then I can play Brandy Carlisle, and then I can play funk. I can play classical. I can play jazz, orchestra, everything. With this, never worrying about changing tracks, never worrying about changing genres, never worrying about having genre-specific playlists. Massive, massive privilege, I think, that the Utopia gives you. So I'm forced to now announce to you that this is my favorite headphone. It's an extraordinary headphone. It's so extraordinary that I'm nowadays no longer reaching out for my half-band Susvaras. I do want to talk about how you want to amp this and the DAC pairings that work with this before I end this, so that you get a sense of how to make this work for you. But before I get into that, I do want to address elephants in the room. Like, what does this do better than the Susvara? Because Susvara is supposed to be better in every way except for bass impact, but is that really true? Because I want to make a controversial argument about Soundstage and why I like the Soundstage of this more. So the Utopia, my friends, is notorious, or not notorious, has been alleged that it doesn't have great soundstage. It has been said that this is not very wide. And it's true. It's a headphone. How wide would a soundstage of a headphone get? Like, yes, there are certain headphones that do soundstage exceedingly well. The RAL SR1A is the monster when it comes to soundstage, because you get this neatly laid out soundstage in front of you and very, very wide and deep. Very true. Great imaging. More realistic. But you know what really matters to me about the RAL soundstage is not so much the fact that it can, it just so deep and it falls in front of you. It's not also the fact that it's very layered, because it is, and it's wonderful. What doesn't matter to me with the RAL soundstage is how wide it is. For me, it doesn't make a huge difference, because it's never going to be as wide as speakers. And there's a reason why I like headphones. Like, I don't need a soundstage that's like very wide, because even a RAL soundstage, right? It's not like I'm hearing sounds from, over there, and I'm hearing sounds from all the way over there or over there. These are smaller differences, guys. The reason why the RAL soundstage, the RAL SR1A soundstage is convincing is because it's got separation. It's got precise imaging. And as long as I get that high quality separation, I don't think a lot of people care about the absolute width of the stage. Even the H800S, the king of soundstage width, it's not like I'm getting like a soundstage that's like 30 feet wide or 20 feet wide. It's still about, this wide, but the fact is, and the soundstage, of course, has a lot to do with psychoacoustics, but at the same time, what I think I like about soundstage, in any headphone that I like, for which I appreciate soundstage, has to do with how sharp images are, how lifelike images are, how well placed images are, how tall images are, and how layered images are. And this does everything. It is difficult to distinguish soundstage performance from imaging performance. These terms are audiophile jargons anyway. But if it comes to imaging, this is not inferior to the Susvaras. In fact, I think it's better. Because the Susvaras, even with certain chains that I have a wider soundstage in the Utopia for sure. As deep as Utopia even, I'll give you that. But I still get the sort of in my cups feeling with certain things that I used to get with the AT650. So it's just, if I were to draw a diagram for the Susvara soundstage, it would start here and then go here. So I get sounds coming from very close to my ears. And then there's some sort of an arc, but it's not as fleshed out, I think. I get different instruments coming from different places. There's something about the soundstage that doesn't appear to be as fleshed out as the soundstage here. It's narrower, but somehow it's more convincing. It's just more convincing as far as the headphone goes, because the image is very tall and they're very fleshed out, and I feel like the images are exactly where they should be. Guys, overall, this has a wider soundstage, but what I'm trying to tell you is that it may not matter. Because even if you crave a wide soundstage, it's not as wide as a RAL record with the SR1A. If you care about headphone soundstage width, go for a RAL or an H800S. Neither of these headphones have massively wide soundstage. So what I'm saying is the soundstage width of the Susvara doesn't matter to me in comparison to the Utopia, because they're both headphone soundstages. However, I do like a good wide soundstage now and then, but then if I do, I would go for an SR1A or even a TC. A TC has a wide soundstage, and it's a luscious wide soundstage, and it's actually much wider than a Utopia or Susvara, and that's when it starts to make a difference. For whatever reason, the LCD5's greater width of stage compared to the Utopia, or even the Susvara's greater width of stage compared to the Utopia, is not as important to me. The imaging here and the size of the images are somehow more impressive. This is a more resolving headphone. But it didn't matter to me, because I've heard resolving headphones all my life, and some of us are perhaps insecure about needing to own the most resolving headphones. If that's your jam, get a RAL requisite SR1A. It is the most resolving headphone. It's not much fun for me. It wasn't fun for me. The SR1A, Susvara, and TC get touted as the most technically proficient headphones, and therefore people's 1, 2, and 3. And I can see why. Maybe some people are detail nuts, detail heads. And if you are, for sure. If you are just bound and smitten to technical performance, I can see why those headphones, or even the Stax headphones, could be your number one headphones. Stax also offer, I think, good value for money, especially if you buy secondhand SR009 and those sorts of things. For some people, you know, that's their be all end all, and I can see why, right? But I think after a point, like me, when you've owned all the resolving headphones, the most resolving headphones, you just find a balance between a headphone that's resolving and good and fun. This is it. So this is more resolving, but I still gravitate towards Utopia more. This has a wider soundstage, but I still gravitate towards Utopia more. What about timbre? So this is supposed to be the king of timbre. This is supposed to be metallic timbre. Is it metallic? I don't hear it anymore. My hearing hasn't degenerated. I just don't. It's partially because of the fact this is broken in. Maybe my palate has enhanced, and maybe I found synergies with tracks because of its timbre. Because this timbre, which can be metallic at some levels, I've heard it at different points with the Utopia. I do think it pairs really well with the electric guitar. It just sounds fluent, fabulous, magnificent. I don't think electric guitars sound as lifelike on the Susvaras. This works with acoustic instruments beautifully, vocals beautifully, sounds very lifelike. Vocals sound slightly more lifelike on the Susvaras, slightly. That's heavily compensated for by the fact that this slams like a truck. It slams so well. It's got this note density. It's got this tonal density, this note weight. And I feel like I'm there. It's again, I'm going to use another tried and tested audiophile jargon that means nothing. This, controversially, I'm going to say sounds more speaker-like. Taller images, more powerful bass impact, just visceral. Overall, a more visceral experience. The graph will not reveal this. And please don't tell me that you can find a way to explain its dynamics by looking at its treble performance and in combination with its bass impact. Its treble is more or less polite. Its bass as it graphed does not reveal a shelf, but it still slams and punches way harder than headphones which have a bass shelf. So that's, you know, a testimony to how not every headphone sounds like how it grasps. So that's it for the comparison between the Susvara and the Utopia. I am preferring the Utopia more because this is an all genre headphone that I just don't need to take off. I don't have to worry about having genre specific playlists. I can just listen to whatever title or Rune throws at me, any genre. And I love being promiscuous with my genres, guys. I love being able to listen to female vocals and then heavy metal and then grunge and then 80s rock, you know, you name it. This cable, by the way, comes from Headgear Audio, an Indian cable manufacturer that I have talked about in the past. Not the same as Niranjan. Niranjan's cables are wonderful, and I had a separate video on that. These are Headgear Audio. So Niranjan runs Ear Audio, and Headgear Audio is a different Indian company, and these cables are very luxurious, as you can tell. This doesn't coil easily. I've just coiled it myself, as you can see. So they have good weight, and they don't have memory, and they feel really nice and feel really premium. I'll leave links to this cable. This is actually not the most expensive cable, but it is wonderful. It's as expensive or as premium feeling as many other headphone cables that are in the kilobuck range. This is not. This is less than, I think, $300. And the other cable I got from Headgear Audio is this copper cable. I think this is their top of the line cable. They call it the Litsa copper cable. I just want to show you this copper cable because it's brilliant aesthetically. I love my Utopia with this. So yeah, so this is their Litsa cable. It's got this beautiful sort of gloss to it, right? I'm not sure if you can see this gloss. It's nice. It catches light and has this glossy effect. Super ergonomic. The shade is beautiful. It's very rose goldish in terms of its shade. I love it. And yeah. So I'll leave links to these cables in my description. Wonderful, wonderful cable from Headgear Audio. Big shout out to you guys. Great service also. Yeah, so that's it for the Utopia and the Susvara. I still think it makes sense to own an Abyss AB12665TC because there's nothing like this in the market. These are tough decisions because in many ways I've talked to Hyphaman much more than I've talked to Abyss, and I love working with Hyphaman. I've worked with them in the past. I respect them. People have complaints about their build quality, and Hyphaman has had build failures, of course. People talk about how their headphones don't look as premium. The Susvara, to me, looks, it looks reasonably premium, but it's not very premium looking. It's not as premium looking as this. So I don't want to diss the Susvara, not just because of Hyphaman and the fact that I like them and I like the people that they work there, but also because it's a wonderful headphone. It is an endgame for many people. If bass impact is not of concern to you, if you somehow can overlook that part of the frequency spectrum, if you just don't listen to genres that token bass frequencies or drums or if drum realism, if you have a different take on drum realism, right? I don't want to be prescriptive about what realism is. Even realism is different things to different people. So, I mean, this is going to be your end game. So this is still a very high-ranking headphone. And I think if I put my reviewer hat on, I would say this is still my number one. But if I put my audiophile hat on, where I'm just going by listening pleasure, and the fact that in my current lifestyle, I like not having to switch headphones, I like not having to switch genres specific to headphones, like I said, I prefer Utopia. I'm going to sell my Susvaras, as a matter of fact. This, on the other hand, I'm not ready to sell yet, because there are certain times when I'm listening to Utopia and I want to gravitate towards this because of its this grunt, this amazing viscerality, and of course this mid-range is not as good as Utopias or Susvara, so I'm not going to be able to listen to a lot of vocals tracks with this, which I love vocals oriented tracks. So this has a use case. Still holding on to this, and very, very open sort of, staging and imaging, and this openness is just mind-blowing on the Abyss. Love it. I was listening to the Abyss today. So I'm going to be doing two rankings that I'm going to be publishing. One has to do with, a very reviewer style ranking. The other is pure joy sort of ranking. And, I'll let you figure out which ranking you consider more important. And finally, I want to talk about source pairings. Utopia can be driven off anything. You can drive it off a dongle, but it does scale with better quality amplification, and synergy is, of course, extremely important. So I have a Hall Audio May, which is wonderful synergy with the Utopia and the TC. The Hall Audio May makes Utopia, I think, it just brings out the Utopia's best staging and imaging qualities, so that you get this insane layering and very pinpoint, fleshed out images. Lovely. Aids to the timbre massively. It just becomes more natural. The Utopia, the treble becomes a little sweeter. The May does have a sweet treble. I've thought about the May and A-beat the May with several DACs, and I think I know what the May sounds like. It's not a colorless sound, so to speak. So the May does have a sweet treble. Works wonderfully well with Utopia. The May slams hard. The Hall Audio May level 2, which is what I have, slams really hard, so it retains the Utopia slam. Very grandiose sounding, and the amp that I'm loving with Utopia is the Ferm Audio Hypsis and Ur. So I got the Hypsis and Ur, and I was like, my God, this is great with the Susvaras, and I've done a review of that, and I'll at some point do a more long-term review of the Hypsis Ur, and get into more technical performance and technicalities of the Hypsos and Ur. But yeah, it's amazing with Utopia, because so I don't think the Ur and Hypsis is warm, but it's very neutral yet natural sounding, I think. And it punches hard. It punches really hard. A lot of people who have heard the Hypsis Ur with the 650 have been surprised how the HD 650 from Sennheiser becomes punchier of the Ferrum Ur and Hypsis. Some people have on the Ur and Hypsis thread on Head5 have also said how the HD 800S becomes punchier on the Ferrum Audio stack. So you can well imagine what the Utopia sounds like. Utopia sounds wonderful. It sounds very tactile, very direct, yet natural on the Ferrum Audio Ur and Hypsis. However, I added something else to my chain. I added a Prima Luna preamplifier, and I added the Prima Luna Evo 400, which is the top of the line preamplifier. Amazing preamplifier, guys. I can't rave about it enough. Check out Kevin Deal's video. Of course, Kevin is a big fan of Prima Luna, and a lot of people know why, and rightly so. It's a wonderful, wonderful company. And I've owned a lot of Prima Luna products in the past. This is my favorite Prima Luna product. This preamp is wonderful. So what happens with this preamp? So every headphone has varying degrees of a 3-blob, like an HD 650 does. The Susvara, for example, I think has, so what I mean by 3-blob is you have sounds coming from here, and you a center image, right? Like the 650 does. The Susvara also has the 3-blob, slightly bigger arc. Utopia. So what happens with the Prima Luna is that this perception of 3-blob goes away. So somehow, although you still get sounds coming from your left ear cup and right ear cup, but they somehow become a more coherent whole, and it just falls, the soundstage falls slightly more in front of you as opposed to like this. It becomes a more like a 3-dimensional wall of sound. So it's not a 2D wall of sound. And the reason I use the term wall is just to make a point that the imaging becomes more in front of you as opposed to right, close to your ears. And this more in front of you imaging, I think, or staging and imaging is just more realistic, which the Prima Luna preamp offers. What also happens, I think, you get a slightly more mid-range intimacy, more mid-range micro nuances, microdynamics you get to hear. and the treble becomes sweeter. So overall, with the Hall Audio May, Ferrum, Hipsis Ohr, and the Prima Luna Evo 400 preamp, this is a champ of a headphone. You can drive it off DAPs. I've recently purchased the FiiO M17, my favorite brick. This is a brick. Other DAPs that people say is a brick is not they are not brick. This is definitive of what a brick is, what a brick feels like, what a brick looks like. It's not crazy heavy. I still like being able to transport it. I am able to carry it from one room to another. By the way, this will get its own review, but this is phenomenal with the TC and with the Utopia. So that might give you a sense of its sound. So it's got ESS chips and THX circuit chips, THX designs, but guys, it does not sound what ESS chips sound like. So stop listening to your chips. This does not sound bright or aggressive. It's fairly dynamic, but I've heard more dynamic sounding devices or gears or DAPs. As a matter of fact, I think my AK DAP is slightly more dynamic. I have the AK Ultima 2000Ts right here. I love this DAP. So all these DAPs should be getting reviews if I can get around doing DAP reviews. This is the AK Ultima 2000T, which has the tube mode, and this is of course a FiiO M17. See the difference in size? It's not night and day, or is it? Yeah, it is. I mean, in terms of thickness, it is. It's much heavier. It's not very heavy. But I'm just, I think, less sensitive to having to carry weight. I wouldn't take it, in my car to work, or maybe I would, but not as often for sure. This is, fairly pocketable, and I have this wonderful AK case in which I carry this. But yeah, I mean, to finish my systems update, I just want to talk about how with the Utopia, you can drive out different DAPs. How does this sound with the FiiO M17? The FiiO M17 is more euphonic than it's bright. It's more mid-range centered than I think it's treble or bass centered. So vocals sound amazing on this, and I do find myself gravitating towards vocal tracks after another with the Utopia with this, which is generally how I think you can figure out what it sounds like and what it does well, right? I also like metal and rock with the FiiO M17, but more so with the AK DAP, which is more dynamic. The FiiO, I think, is more lush. It's not warm per se. I think it's largely neutral, but there's a slightly more mid-range emphasis, I think, with how the sound is presented. And this works really well because there is mid-range focus with the TC as well, because the TC benefits from, a more mid-range centric chains, so to speak. So you can drive this off anything. It's not picky in the sense that it's hard to drive. I do think you'll find different synergies and slightly different interpretations of the Utopia sound depending on the source gears you have. But go for it. I mean, this is highly, highly relevant in 2022. This is my favorite headphone in 2022. I'm going to be revising my rankings on Amplify, my sort of reviewer hat worn rankings or videos that I've done on this channel. They stand. As far as that goes, I still think the Susvara is the most high performance headphone on the planet, followed by the TC and then the SR009S and then the LCD5. But if I was ranking purely in terms of audiophile listening pleasure, focusing on all-rounder capabilities, being able to play every track well, that's an important caveat. This would be one. So guys, that's it. I hope this was interesting, even if mildly this was important for me to do, because people ask me what I like, and I feel like once you've done this as long as I have, which is not very long, but for some amount of time, I do think it's important to share views as views change, because I also encourage you to change your views if you have to, right? I mean, we don't have to stick to, there's no shame in changing your mind. There's no shame in changing your opinion on a headphone and your approach to the hobby, because that's what keeps this exciting and interesting. So you don't have to be that reviewer who has said that this is the best, or that audiophile who has said that this is the best headphone, and I'm going to stick to that till I die. There's no reason to. If you change your mind, you change your mind. So that's how things have fallen for me. I have absolutely no affiliation with FOCAL headphones. I've visited their showroom once in Bangkok. I've never talked to FOCAL. I've talked to their employees in Thailand. Some of whom are lovely, and some of whom didn't speak a lot of English, but that's what it is. Not everyone has to speak English, but the point remains that, I have no relationship whatsoever with FOCAL. I get nothing from praising FOCAL, but I also say that this is not my only pair of Utopia. I bought this used, and I recently bought a second pair from headphones.com, the greatest guys in business in audio. Headphones.com, the experience I have dealing with headphones.com online, buying stuff from them is unsurpassable. I get a better experience working with headphones.com or buying from headphones.com than I do with any other online retailer. I've also worked with THX Stereo, and it's been a great experience. But headphones.com are my favorite guys in the business. They do so much for this hobby. Love them. And I'm going to leave a link to their website if you want to buy Utopia after watching this video. And I get nothing out of headphones.com and my relationship with them. I get no money from promoting them, of course. I just deeply appreciate what they do for this hobby. So that's it, guys. Thank you. I hope this was, like I said, mildly interesting because this was fun for me to do. Now and then I do want to do system updates. So stay safe wherever you are, and enjoy the music, and give this a like if this was useful. Subscribe if you have not, and stay tuned for more. Bye-bye.